So I'd like to introduce everyone to Dr. David Gordan. Dr. David Gordan is a medical doctor. He is the former dean of the School of Health Professions and Studies at U of M Flint, and he was also the founding dean of the University of Akron's School of Health Sciences. Dr. Gordan will be here with us today. He is currently on staff at Michigan Medicine. He's had long history in public health. He has a company called Take Charge of Your Health, which is really looking at working with organizations and individuals to help offer them, health consulting from everything from your physical health to your mental health to pharmaceuticals and things like that. And so he's going to talk with us today about the vaccine, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's good to be here this afternoon. And let me just say from the outset, with my presentations, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions that you might have. No question's a dumb question. All questions are politically correct. So for example, I happen to be a cardiovascular pathologist, and some of you may say, gee, pathology, aren't you the guys with hunchbacks that work in dark basements, for example? That's okay. It's okay to ask a question like that. Turns out there may be some truth to that because I do have scoliosis, which is the most common form of being a hunchback here in the United States. But I'm the only pathology colleague of mine that has that condition. So the bottom line is that I want you to get your questions answered. Let me also, I don't really have any financial disclosures, but I will say that back from 1997 to 2001, I did happen to work for Pfizer Corporation. At that time, it was Park Davis here in Ann Arbor. And I don't have any financial ties with them at all, or I don't consult with them at all or anything like that. But it was an interesting time because some of the technology that was used to make the vaccines that we have now from both Pfizer and Moderna were technologies that we were working on at that time. So that technology, in terms of making an mRNA expressing system, has been around for a while. It's not, I know people think that this has been a rush. Some people think that this has been a rush vaccine. This is a brand new, and yes, this is the first time we have so-called mRNA vaccines. But the technology has really been around for actually literally a couple of decades. So anyway, let me go ahead and get started. As Erica mentioned, we have a consulting company, Take Charge, and we're happy to provide these kind of talks to any groups, but also to deal with individuals' health questions and things like that. So what I thought I'd do is to start a little bit with a little bit of background on the virus itself. Now, I apologize because a lot of virus literature has been in the news a lot and people probably know a fair amount, although there may be a varied understanding. But I want to really focus mostly on the whole issue of vaccines. But to really understand, the issue of the vaccine, it's helpful to know a little bit about the virus. The virus basically has a very standard, animal virus type of structure to it in terms of viruses that infect animals as opposed to other things. So it has, very importantly, this oily layer called the lipid membrane. And that's what this big circle is. Stuck to the membrane are these proteins that stick out, and these are the so-called spike proteins that you may have heard about. And it's to these spike proteins that the vaccines are targeting in terms of being able to help the body make antibodies that recognize this, because this is what the virus uses to contact your cells and to enter into your cells and cause destruction of the different cell components and things like that. The virus has its own mRNA, that's what's indicated here in red, and it has a bunch of other proteins that are specific for the virus. And it basically, all of this machinery is not only a blueprint for making new virus, but also machinery and enzymes to take over the whole cell's metabolism, to force the cell to stop doing what it would normally do and just make virus until the cell basically dies and then breaks open and then releases a lot more virus. So that's how this particular virus acts. So this is what I've summarized here on this slide. It has the spike proteins that bind to the outer cells, and that's important when we come to talk about the vaccines, which are made to that. And then in addition to the virus bursting open cells and killing the cells and spreading to other cells and doing the same thing, it also attracts the body's defense cells. So eventually you start making antibodies, and other white blood cells start recognizing the virus. And one of the things that's become apparent with this particular infection is that you have damage of your tissues by basically two mechanisms. One is direct damage by the virus, and secondly is damage by these immune cells, which unfortunately, even though they're trying to get rid of the virus and eradicate the virus, they themselves release a whole bunch of other enzymes that just indiscriminately, kill a lot of surrounding cells. So it'll be like, if you have an argument in a bar and you send in the U.S. Special Forces to clear the bar out, they may be able to get rid of the first two people who were, starting the fight. But unfortunately, with, grenades and things like that, they'll likely kill a lot of other people as well. So that's part of some people may have heard of the inflammatory storm or a cytokine storm. And that is something that actually worsens this disease. And this is what lands a lot of people on respirators with a lot of lung damage and also damage to other organs. So that's a bit about the virus. It's felt to spread mostly through aerosols. And these are really tiny droplets, really almost too small for you to be able to see with your eye. I mean, the best example of this is, in the wintertime when you're outside and you breathe and you see this mist, that comes out that you can't really see in the warm weather. That's what the aerosol cloud is. And you know how far that can travel. And so that's one of the reasons that people are concerned about aerosols. And so the aerosols are the very tiny things that can spread quite a distance, up to 6 feet, and in some cases hang around in the air for a while. It also lodges on larger droplets. And these are droplets that we all generate when we talk or sing or do anything like that. And so this is the reason for, wanting to wear masks and wanting to social distance so that we can hopefully prevent the spread of this. It may be spread by other means, such as contaminated surfaces. For example, if someone has the virus and they rub their nose or sneezes and the sneezes on a surface and then they touch doorknobs and things like that, that is an area, but that is not felt to be the main way that this virus spreads. By far, mostly in terms of aerosol spread by being in a closed environment with other people, breathing their air, not having masks, not being distant from these folks. That's the way that this virus spreads. And then, unfortunately, in a way, most people who get this virus are asymptomatic. They don't have any symptoms at all. It's the minority of people who get fever, headaches, diarrhea, and some of the common things they get. And they often may have a delay of getting these symptoms, days before, they may have been infected days before they actually manifest these symptoms. Why is this important? Well, it's important because someone can be infected, not know it at all, and can make contact with a whole host of other people. I mean, you can imagine, for example, let's take a church service, where an infected person comes in and mingles with a lot of the congregation and things like that, or an infected choir member sings out loudly, for example, for the, the enjoyment of the congregation. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to that person, they could be spreading the virus to all the people, in the given room and things like that. So that's how this virus appears to spread. Now, a couple of things to know about. We had the original virus that was identified and is felt to have come from the province of Wuhan in China. As we're in an international world now, there appears to be more strains that are developing. Needless to say, these viruses, not unlike the influenza viruses, tends to undergo mutations. And so there are slight changes that are occurring. And as you may have heard, there have been 2 more variants identified, one in South Africa and also one in Germany, and then also in Britain as well. So we've got now 3 new variants, or a total of 4 different variants. And all of these are likely to be here in the United States eventually, if it's just a matter of time. And so at this point, we don't know if these variants are going to be much different. Some of these variants appear to be much more infectious compared to the original coronavirus, and so it spreads a lot more quickly. But as far as we know right now, they are all susceptible to the vaccines that are coming out, and we're not aware that they cause any more severe disease processes compared to the original virus. I'm just going to go briefly over some of these slides because I do want to get to the vaccine, but currently we don't have any specific drugs that are highly effective at destroying this virus. This is unlike antibiotics that are used for bacteria. And this obviously is a major focus of many scientists and many pharmaceutical companies now, trying to develop antiviral agents that can be used once someone gets infected. There is being increasing use of so-called antibodies. These are specially engineered antibodies, oftentimes derived from people who have been infected. These antibodies are best when you've just gotten infected in terms of trying to sequester the virus and try to hopefully decrease the amount of viral load that damages your organs. It is not felt to be anything that prevents, because these monoclonal antibodies don't last in your system over a period of time. And again, the whole idea behind making a vaccine is that you're training your own body's immune system to continually make such antibodies, so that they can combat the virus if you get infected at a later time. Vaccines, we hope, will be effective, but in the meantime, we have to do things like what we call social distancing and things like that. So it's very important to wear a face mask. This helps not only you in terms of not spreading the virus, but also helps protect you from other people's aerosols who may be infected. And again, we don't know always who is infected. Similarly, keeping a good 6 feet from other people in this time is very important. That's what we call social distancing. And then frequently washing your hands, because again, we have a tendency to touch our mouths, touch our nose, and then touch other surfaces. So if we frequently disinfect our hands with alcohol or hand disinfectant and things like that, that helps to ameliorate the virus. This is just showing you a diagram of the proper way to put on a mask. So this happens to be a cloth mask. Some of these can also be paper masks as well. The main things to note about is that first you should wash your hands before putting on the mask, because your hands may be contaminated. You want to touch just the outside of the mask. You also want the mask to fit well and fit over both the nose and also over the mouth, and preferably underneath the chin. And then you want to be sure that the mask is a bit tight so that you don't have a lot of air seeping out of the edges of the mask. So all of these are just good things. I know that a lot of people have been making their own masks with different types of cloths. Some cloths are better than others. And as far as I know, there are no good standards for homemade cloth masks. The only thing that I would advise you is to say, if you use something like, for example, bed sheets or things like that, make sure it's a fabric that is thick enough that you can't see through it. If you can visibly see things through the fabric, it's probably too porous to really be of any effect in terms of keeping these aerosols away from you, as well as keeping your own aerosols from infecting other people. Now, can everyone see this particular diagram? This is basically just to show you some of the common activities that cause release of aerosols into the air. You're showing you here, these bars here show you that, the higher the bar, the more of these aerosol concentrations that you generate. So normal breathing through your mouth or your nose gives a certain amount. One of the biggest expressors of these aerosols happens to be singing or public speaking. That really gives a lot of these aerosols out. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of churches, I know my temple, for example, I'm in the choir, but we all do our singing remote and we record them for now during this pandemic. We're not meeting in enclosed spaces to either rehearse or certainly not to have services. But certainly also coughing and public speaking are activities that produce a lot of aerosols. When aerosols are spread, they can spread a good distance. And if you're wearing a mask, that really prevents the spread from going more than just a couple of feet in front of you. As I mentioned, most people will not have any symptoms at all. Some people will just have minor symptoms, like a colleague of mine, all he noticed was that he couldn't taste anymore after a while, and he couldn't smell anymore. That was the only symptom that he really had. But the most common symptoms, if you're going to have symptoms, are fever, cough, and sneezing. And then you can also have more serious things. Certainly if you can get very fatigued. The shortness of breath is one of the things that we worry the most about, because you can have very low oxygen levels in your blood because your lungs have been damaged. And this is the kind of thing that tends to send people to the hospital. And this is probably the main thing that you hear about, people eventually having to be on a respirator, and then most of the deaths occur if you are not able to turn this disease process around. The problem is that a lot of these symptoms, particularly fever, some cases cough, runny nose, these are non-specific. They can come with a common cold, they can come with influenza. And so you really have to have a specific test for the virus. And typically that's done as an RNA test or a test for viral antibodies. And that's the real test that is needed to really make the diagnosis of a coronavirus infection. I wanted to show this slide because I think this obviously is a worldwide type of thing, but as it's played out in the United States in particular, these are data affecting coronavirus cases on different races. You can see that African Americans and Latino individuals have been overrepresented in the people who have gotten this particular disease. And so this is particularly important for populations of color in terms of dealing with. Just to show you here, if you look at just the hospitalizations and death of people by this coronavirus, people of color, particularly African Americans, Hispanic, 3 to 4 times is more likely to be hospitalized and almost 3 times as likely to die of this disease than the general population. So this is a serious thing that I think particularly certain populations definitely need to have access to, in my opinion, the vaccine and ways of being able to prevent this. I won't go into a lot of the speculation as to why this is the case. If people want to discuss that, I can certainly ask that towards the end, but this is a fact that's been demonstrated again and again. We call it health disparities that have been brought out by this epidemic, which in many cases mirror many of the other health disparities that we have in medicine in this country. As you've known, many different groups, universities, government agencies, companies have been fiercely working over the last several months to develop vaccines and different treatments for this disease. A lot of these things have only, a couple of them have now finished going through clinical trials. And I want to talk about this a little bit to give you some sense as to what the safety of these vaccines or what a vaccine needs to go through in terms of safety testing before we release it to the public. We really want to develop both drugs to this infection and also vaccines, which are both safe and effective. But again, the clinical testing must be done carefully. Let me just show you this diagram because first of all, when you're trying to develop any new drug or vaccine, first step that you don't often hear about in the press is what we call preclinical testing. So in the case of the vaccine, when they made this, RNA construct, and again, the RNA is like the instructions to make the spike protein so that the body can make antibodies to that. Well, all of these different agents, they first are tested in the laboratory. And they're tested first to see if they're actually making the protein that they want. Two, they test them on cells to also see in the Petri dish if they are going to kill the cells and do any kind of toxicity. And needless to say, they may start out with many candidate vaccines and many candidate drugs, and only a few will pass these different screening tests. And so all of this has to happen. And then after they've tested it successfully in the laboratory on cells, then they go to what they call animal testing. And typically that's either on small animals such as mice, rats. Typically it culminates into testing on primates, monkeys or baboons, because these are individuals who are genetically closest to humans. And all of that goes on, and it has to be shown that the drug is safe in those tests well before it gets to any human testing at all. So again, wanted to emphasize that, any of these things have gone through a fair amount of testing before they even begin doing any kind of human testing. Then the first phase of the clinical testing, which is now testing on humans, it's divided up typically classically into three phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 typically is where they're giving to start out with very small doses of whatever the agent that they're using. And they're giving this to humans and testing all kinds of things. They want to see whether or not it causes any adverse effects on the human, any problems with the blood counts, any problems with any of the organ function or anything like that. And then if they don't get any problems, then they slowly increase the dose up again until they get to what they think is a maximal tolerable dose. During this, they're also testing to see, again, how is the drug taken up? How is the vaccine, distributed, throughout the body and things like that. So they're always looking for any red flags that might occur. And this phase typically involves maybe 100 people or something like that. It's a small number of folks. Those drugs that pass that testing and are felt to be, not cause any damage or anything like that, then they are advanced to what we call the phase 2 trial. The phase 2 trial is now trying to do an initial look to see, do any of these agents have any efficacy in preventing the disease or ameliorating the disease? So now you have groups of larger patients. Typically it may be 150 or maybe 500 patients or something like that. In the usual setting, you're trying to give this to people and this kind of put it in the context of this vaccine. So you give people the vaccine, you give typically half the people are given vaccine, half people are giving a placebo thing, which is not effective. And you're looking to see if you get more infections among the people who get the placebo versus the people who get the vaccine. And then if you get some promising results from these, again, oftentimes a lot of these candidates fall out because they're not felt to be effective or some problem comes up. Maybe in one case, you might find some evidence of kidney damage or something like that, or something worrisome about someone developing anemia or something like that. And so if that happens, then those are discontinued. And only those drugs that then go past this phase go into the phase 3 trial. And that I'll talk about specifically for both the Pfizer vaccine as well as the Moderna vaccine. In this phase 3, now they're testing it on thousands of patients. And I'll show you the numbers for the two vaccines. And they have to, again, do this over a period of time, over several months. They're monitoring these people very carefully. They're giving half the placebo, half of the actual true vaccine. And they're looking to see not only is it effective against preventing someone getting an infection, but is it also, do any of these agents causing any bad problems? Are they causing any anemia? Are they causing any damage to any of the organs? Now, you probably heard the term warp speed used in the development of these vaccines. Typically, one of the things that has allowed this vaccine, these mRNA types of vaccines to work more quickly is that the platform that we're using is a lot more efficient than the way we've made vaccines in the past. But I think part of it is also that as you're giving it to these people, you're testing over several weeks to several months period of time, looking for any damage or any problems that may occur. So this just summarizes all the testing that is done. And so let me now fast track to what we really know about this. And this is just a brief slide to say, as we continue to test different drugs and different vaccines, for this virus, some of you may be asked to participate in the clinical research trial. And well, you should know that, you have a number of rights if you're going to participate in something like this. And some of these are highlighted here. And I can talk about this more if people have questions about themselves wanting to participate in such a trial. Okay, and then after the FDA gives its approval, and again, these trials have been approved, these 2 vaccines have been approved for what they call emergency use. That means that, it is felt that they're safe enough to be used to help stem the tide of this particular epidemic, but they're still collecting data on these people who have been in this trial, again, to look for more longer term possible side effects. Are there going to be any birth defects? Are there going to be any injuries to pregnant women or babies? Will there be any negative interactions with other medications? Will, some of these vaccines potentially cause cancers? So far, there has been no data that suggests any of these things are going to happen. But again, we have to go through the whole time in terms of really continuing to collect data on these things. And this is the standard for any drugs that come out on the market. Even after something has been approved by the FDA, they're still supposed to monitor them for other side effects and things like that. Okay, so some general notes about vaccine. Effective vaccines train the body's immune cells to recognize specific viruses and to make either antibodies to inactivate the virus or kill the cells infected with the virus. This is generated at an earlier time because we haven't been successful in getting vaccines to every virus. For example, we still don't have a good vaccine for the human immunodeficiency virus that causes AIDS. And then we have still a lot to learn about these particular vaccines that have come out. We still have a lot to learn about how long the immunity will last. And certainly this will be a subject of ongoing research. Now, this is a summary of the current vaccines, the top 2, one by Moderna and one by Pfizer BioNTech. These are the currently 2 approved ones in the United States, approved by our FDA. There are other vaccines that have different methodologies that are still in clinical trials and are being tested. And as far as I know, have not yet gotten approval by the Food and Drug Administration. But again, we're going to talk a little bit about now the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. The way they developed these vaccines, they isolated the genetic code from the coronavirus. They particularly got the genetic code specifically for the spike proteins that stick out of the surface of the virus that the virus uses to attach the cells. And then they use this to put this instruction just for this spike protein into cells with a particular delivery method to get the cells to make this spike protein so that the body can then make antibodies to that. So here's an example of the particles that are used by the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. What it is, and I can't emphasize this enough, this is not a virus, even though it may have some similarities in structures. What this is like an oily droplet, if you will, with an oil membrane on the outside, which contains what we call the messenger RNA that has the instructions to make this particular spike protein that I showed you previously, which is on the outside of the virus. And so the idea is that these particles are injected into the muscle as part of the vaccine. They fuse with your individual muscle cells and other cells that are particularly adept at picking up the mRNA. The mRNA instructs the cells to make this spike protein, present it on its surfaces, and then your body's immune cells will recognize this as foreign and start making antibodies to this. And that's how the vaccine works. And typically when you give one injection of this, you get a certain response in terms of cells making antibodies and also other white blood cells being able to directly recognize the virus. You get an even more enhanced response if you give a second injection after 2 or 3 weeks. It's like a booster effect with the immunization. And that's the reason for these vaccines being given in 2 doses separated by 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. So people ask, for example, gee, is it safe? Has it been tested in a number of people? Before it got FDA approval, and I've gone through a lot of the data that the FDA had to review in order to approve this. So you should know that a good 43,000 patients were tested in this particular vaccine, approximately half given the vaccine, half given the placebo. People often ask the question, well, are there any people of color involved in these tests? Well, about 9% of these folks, maybe not the same percentage as in the US population overall, but there was a reasonable representation of African Americans, Hispanic individuals, and also a good fifth of them had at least one coexisting condition. As you know, many pre-existing conditions such as diabetes, heart disease are risk factors for people doing poorly once they get infected. And with this, and with several months follow-up, this vaccine was felt to be 95% effective in preventing COVID virus. In other words, of the people who got the placebo, the vast majority of the people who got the infections were in the placebo group, and 95% of the people who got the vaccine were prevented from getting the COVID infection. So in fact, that's on par with many excellent vaccines that we have right now. The preliminary data that we have so far is that that was effective against the original strain that we were dealing with here in the United States. As far as we know, preliminary data suggests it's also as effective against these new variant viruses that are being recently identified in other countries and now beginning to be identified here in the United States. But since viruses tend to change, this is going to take constant surveillance, and people will have to be testing and retesting. And there may come a time when we have to generate new vaccines if a variant becomes so different that some of these vaccines become less effective. Now, this particular clinical trial did not test for safety in pregnant women or in any kids younger than 16 years of age. And that is why for now, these vaccines are not really recommended for these groups. And it is unknown, and this is very important, it is unknown if you are vaccinated and have immunity, does that prevent you from still getting the virus? You may not get sick from the virus, but it doesn't necessarily prevent you from transmitting the virus to somebody else. Or at least we don't know if it prevents disease transmission. Everyone hopes so, but we don't have enough data to be able to say whether or not that is the case. You should know that there have been a couple of reported cases, it's been rare, of people getting infected with the coronavirus, the COVID-19, recovering from that, and presumably they had some immunity to it, but then getting infected again. Now, we don't know the details of those cases. We don't know if maybe their immune system wasn't up to par and did not make effective things. And so until we really have that information, this is why all of the public health officials are recommending that even after you get your vaccination, don't feel like you're a Superman or Superwoman or anything like that. You still should social distance, you still wear a mask, still wash your hands, still do all of those things until, as a general population, the number of these infections go way down, before we start relaxing and, with mask wearing and all of these preventive features. I'm just showing you here some of the side effects with the Pfizer vaccine. The most common thing is just a bit of pain at the site of injection, like into the shoulder. Relatively few people get a fever. Some people will get fatigue particularly most of these symptoms come after the second injection. A few people will get some swollen glands. Almost no one has come down with any severe reactions to the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. You may have heard of some stories of, I think, another company's vaccine. It's not to say that it is going to happen to someone, but so far we have not seen any severe reactions. Now quickly to get to the Moderna vaccine, and very similar type of thing, similar structure, slightly different code that they've put into for the spike protein. Different codes are coding for different parts of that spike protein, but basically the same principle. In this case, they tested these in about 30,000 patients. Again, half given placebo, half, given the actual active vaccine. A good number were African American and a good number were Asian, about 20% were Hispanic. They tested people only who were 18 years and older, so we don't have any data for younger people or pregnant women. And again, it's proposed to give 2 doses, in this case, 4 weeks apart. And this was found to be about as effective as the Pfizer vaccine, 94% versus 95% effective in preventing the disease. And again, this appears to be effective against these newly identified strains. But again, it's also unknown again with this vaccine as to whether or not this will prevent someone from transmitting the disease to others. So I want to underscore that, a good number of people, we've had now a fair amount of experience. And again, this experience is ongoing. Just to finish up here, these are the types of symptoms that people have been getting with the Moderna vaccine, very similar to with the Pfizer vaccine. Injection site pain is the most one, and this only lasts for about a day or so. Some people get headache, fatigue, and things like that. A rare person has gotten pneumonia, a rare person has gotten clots to the lungs, And it's important to point out, when you're dealing with large populations that you're testing like this, you have to really look at the data very hard and get enough so people may get a heart attack regardless of whether or not they get vaccinated, and so that necessarily doesn't prevent heart attacks as far as we know. And so you have to look at these things carefully and to be able to say, okay, if more than one person or a number of people are coming down with a particular adverse event, is it a higher likelihood that they got the vaccine versus didn't get the vaccine, to be able to see whether or not the vaccine may in fact be causative. Okay, and then now the rollout of this vaccine, and I think you folks were already involved with this. So the early phase was focusing on people who were healthcare personnel, as well as people in long-term care facilities. I think the rationale for the healthcare personnel was that they were the ones who were coming in contact with a lot of the sickest people. And so you wanted to protect your health workforce so they could take care of other people. You also don't want these same people spreading disease to other people who are coming in with all sorts of, vulnerabilities, like some of them have cancer, some of them may have other problems, heart disease and things like that. And then phase two is then people over 75 years old and frontline essential workers working in restaurants and other things. And then eventually we'll have the rollout to all people eventually. So here's a concern slide, and that is that, and part of the main reason I wanted to give this talk was really to answer people's questions, because as this chart shows from a survey back in June of last year, and this was from a recent talk given by Dr. Fauci that I attended online, you can see that if you look at the number of people and ask them, are you going to take the vaccine? Will you be willing to take the vaccine? The green shows you the people who are saying, yes, they will take the vaccine. The orange are the people who are not sure. The yellow, which is a sizable amount, are saying, no, they will not take the vaccine. Now, as it's turned out over time, and I believe this graph shows it a little bit here, the number of people who are saying they will take the vaccine, that's increasing over time. So back in September, in this case, about 34% of all folks said they would take the vaccine. 63% said, now it's up to 71%. And then this breaks it down into different groups here. This is a study done by the Kaiser Family Foundation. But the concern is that we want as many people to take this vaccine as possible. Now, why is that? First of all, we really feel that this is the main thing that's going to be able to put a stop to this epidemic eventually, to give us handles around so that we can begin to come back to kind of a normal economy, normal life and many things, and really put an end to a lot of the high hospitalization and high number of deaths. As you probably know, we've surpassed now the 400,000 deaths that have occurred over the past year since this pandemic started, just here in the United States. So that's one reason. The other reason is indicated by this diagram. You may have heard of the term herd immunity. So let me try to explain this. If we look at this left-hand panel, this is a diagram. Each circle represents an individual. The black diagram person here is someone who is infected with the coronavirus. So if none of these people have been vaccinated, all of these people are susceptible. And what you have is a multiplier effect. So one person in a day may contact 2, 3, or 4 people. Each of those people can contact another 2, 3, or 4 people, and so on and so on. And that's how you get this exponential spread of the virus, which we saw in this country. We've gone through multiple waves of this now, beginning back in the early part of 2020 in March, and then another surge around September. And then we were in the midst still of another surge that started around the holidays between Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. So the purpose of the vaccine, and the reason that you need to get a large number of percentage of the population vaccinated, and Dr. Fauci estimates between 70 and 85% of individuals need to be vaccinated, is that in this case, now here we have the infected person here, but if this person is vaccinated, and this person is vaccinated, and this person is vaccinated, and this person, the people that they're likely to come in contact with, the vast majority of them are not going to get infected, and they cannot transmit the disease. And so you need the majority of your people. Now, yes, if this person happens to contact this person who didn't get a vaccination, then that person can come down with the disease. But then that person also comes against this person, this person, this person, and cannot further transmit the disease. Whereas if you have this situation, if this person contacts and infects this person can go around and infect pretty much everybody else. And so that's the whole reason of wanting the majority of our US population to get vaccinated, so that we can get the kind of herd immunity as we have achieved with a number of other diseases. So for example, things like polio, they're essentially non-existent in part because of our vaccinations, and we have the kind of herd immunity. So if you have one person who's infected by polio now, in the United States, it's highly unlikely to spread. That herd immunity is beginning to break down a little bit with things like measles. We've been very successful in this country in getting most people vaccinated, but unfortunately, with an increasing number of people who don't want to be vaccinated for things like, chicken pox and things like that, we unfortunately, in measles, we're seeing a surge in some of those cases. So hopefully we can do that. But this is the rationale behind trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. So I certainly hope all of you will consider strongly getting vaccinated. And I don't believe in telling people to do things that I wouldn't do myself. So here's a picture of myself getting my vaccination. This was 2 weeks ago, and I'm due to get my second injection vaccination coming Monday. And as far as the symptoms that I had, the only thing that I experienced was just some soreness in that shoulder. I didn't have any fever. I didn't have any fatigue. Now, again, that was the first injection, and maybe that I'll have more symptoms, with the second injection. I put this slide in here because there are a number of reasons why, even if you get the vaccination, you may still come down with COVID. First of all, the vaccine is not 100% effective. And so there's a chance, even with 94, 95% effectiveness, you may be one of the lucky 5% that, is not adequately immunized and still comes down with this. We don't understand exactly why this is. It takes also a few weeks for the vaccine to fully build up your immunity. So if you get vaccinated, don't go out the next day and say, gee, I'm invincible now, because it takes a few weeks for the cells to build up in your body immune system to do it. It's also unclear how long the vaccination-induced immunity will last and if booster shots will be needed. And then we're always on the lookout for new strains of coronavirus. So far, again, we've been lucky. Everything so far, it looks like it's, is going to be taken care of by the vaccine. But, we have to at least be on the lookout for the possibility that we may get a different strain that at some point will not respond to this vaccine. So it may end up being something very similar to the influenza vaccines, where you have to generate a new vaccine basically almost every year in terms of being able to take care of those influenza cases. To underscore a couple of other things, we talked about some of the treatments for COVID if you get it. I want to underscore a couple of things. Hydroxychloroquine got a lot of press at the beginning. This is not effective. I think most people will say, that it's not effective, in fact, can do more harm. And so again, for now, getting vaccinated and also continuing to wear your mask, continue to do the social distancing and getting vaccinations, these are still the most effective ways of preventing you getting this disease. And I want to end with just a couple of common questions that have come up. So is the vaccine available for kids 5 years and up? Not yet. Research is still needed to see if this will be fine, and that research is ongoing. Is the vaccine safe for children? Basically the same question here as I mentioned, they didn't have kids younger than 16 in either of those trials. Similarly, they did not include pregnant women in those clinical trials. So more research is needed to know about that. And then does the flu vaccine have any mitigating factors to those, especially if you have a pre-existing condition? So probably not. One flu vaccine a year is often not effective against the flu from a second year. And so it's unlikely that if you just got the regular flu vaccine, that's going to protect you against coronavirus. Will these vaccines give you COVID? I know some people have had this concern. And the answer is a flat no. These vaccines are not viruses. Some vaccines in the past, for example, you may know that the polio virus vaccines, some of them have been attenuated viruses. That's not the case for here. So there's really no conceivable way that these vaccines will give you COVID. You may get some symptoms. They may seem like an influenza type of thing, but they should be very short-lived, only last a few days. And no, it will not give you COVID. And then finally, if you've already had an COVID infection, people are asking, should they still get the vaccine? The current recommendations, we don't have enough data on this, but I think most doctors at this point would recommend going ahead and getting the vaccine, particularly once you've cleared the COVID infection, because we don't know how long that immunity will last. And as I mentioned, there have been some reported cases of people getting COVID twice. And so that's why it is recommended now that even if you have had COVID or you think you've had COVID, it's probably a good thing to get the vaccine. And then this is just some links, one from the Centers for Disease Control, and also one here is a nice summary from the New England Journal of Medicine, prominent journal that doctors use to get their information from, that answers a lot of frequently asked questions about COVID and the vaccine. So with that, let me end and let me see if there are any questions that people have.
I think I caught most of what you said between the two vaccines, but just to maybe clarify if I missed something. Between the two vaccines, it seems like we still hear this, that, and the other about one being better than the other. They sound the same to me, just pretty close, but
yeah,
from what
yeah,
you talked about, is that so?
I mean, they're pretty equivalent. I mean, there's not much difference between a 95% effectiveness and a 94% effectiveness. In fact,
Right.
you know, I don't think anyone could really tell the difference. So most people would consider them equivalent in terms of their efficacy at this point.
Okay.
Now, what you may find is that unfortunately, we don't have ready availability for both vaccines in all communities. So for example, I don't know what's being offered up in the Flint area. Here at University of Michigan, they have access to the Pfizer vaccine, and so that's what they're giving out to people. So I would say if you're offered either the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, either one is fine. They're about equivalent in that. The only caveat is that if you get one vaccine as your first injection, stick with the same vaccine for the second injection, because they are different enough in terms of what they train your immune system to react against. So you should not mix up vaccines. So if you start with Pfizer, make the second dose Pfizer. If you start with Moderna, make the second dose Moderna.
Yeah, because I think we have Moderna where we are.
Okay, yeah, that should be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Gordan, this is Tom Wiley. I'm the Director of Innovation and Wellness at PVM, and our vaccine clinics are rolling out across our senior communities. And one of the things we've noticed is a fairly good rate of participation amongst the older adult residents, but we see a lot of hesitancy in staff. And I wondered if you had any advice for us, how we might be able to address that.
First of all, just like I'm giving this talk to you folks, I'm happy to talk to any staff, about this and basically just sort of go over, a lot of the data. I think to me, the strongest data for safety are, data such as I showed you here in terms of what was done for each of these vaccines in terms of approval. And I think that also, the other thing is that of all the people that I've talked to, a couple of my colleagues, for example, have mentioned that they got some fatigue after they got the second injection, but the side effects have been very minimal. The vast majority of people have just gotten some soreness in their arm. And so there have been some concerns. For example, I think fortunately there's been some misinformation out in the general press about some of these vaccines changing your DNA. These vaccines have no capability of interfering at all with your DNA. And that's one of the things that needs to be underscored. In terms of allergies, both of these vaccines, they say, they're basically mRNA usually, by itself is not allergenic. Some of the components, of course, there's some sucrose in here and some other chemicals that help preserve the things there. There may be some allergies to some of those types of things. But again, as you saw in the trial data, hardly anybody came down with any adverse events. I will say this, for example, when they gave out the vaccine at the University of Michigan, and I would advise anyone any site for this, once you get the injection, there should be a wait period where you sit down and be observed by somebody for about 15 minutes. If someone who has a history of allergies, maybe 30 minutes, and it should be in a facility that if you do have an allergic reaction, someone has an EpiPen, someone has the ability, to help and treat that immediately. So it shouldn't be done out in the street somewhere, something like they should have the capability of handling an adverse reaction like an allergic reaction. But I would say that, the main thing is basically just to, specifically ask people, well, what are the concerns that they have? If there's really a concern about, long-term safety for these things, I believe in being very open and honest. Now we have several months of safety data and we'll continue to get more safety data in this. I've not heard of any, significant serious effects of either of these two viruses. And so as vaccines go, these are as safe as any vaccines that I'm familiar with. But again, oftentimes it's important to find out from a staff member specifically, what is it that they're concerned about, and to be able to kind of reinforce it. And again, if you want to refer anybody to me, I'm happy to talk to them individually, and, address whatever questions they have.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up, I think there might be some confusion that you could help, because you hear about, if you have an allergy, you might need to be concerned. But when we talk allergies, we're not talking about me being allergic to cat dander.
That's correct.
So I think if you could help clear up what's really meant by an allergy when it comes to the vaccines, that would be helpful.
No, you make a good point, because a lot of people have allergies, but they typically have allergies to things like milk, or they have ragweed or things like that. These vaccines don't have any of those components. one of the nice things from a science point of view is that in the past, for example, a lot of like some of the attenuated viruses, like for polio, they were made in actual chicken eggs. And so anybody who was allergic to eggs or dairy products, some of those proteins got mixed in with the vaccine material and they would have a reaction to that. This is essentially totally synthetic, and so it's really only if they happen to have an allergy to some of the chemical components like alcohol or something like that, which would be unusual. And as the trial indicated, hardly any of the people that they tested had any type of allergic reactions. And again, if they did, at most it would be maybe a wheal that would be treatable by either just waiting for time or at most an EpiPen or something like that. So yes, the allergies, people have allergies to a lot of things, but they're highly unlikely to have an allergy to this particular vaccine.
Dr.
Yes.
Gordan, can you talk to us just a little bit about the numbers? There are lots of data being passed around Facebook that highlight, these really unusual cases. And so, that's something that is very difficult to combat. Can you kind of just share with us, how does this one, there's one going around now where this healthy doctor died and everybody's sharing that and it's causing a lot of pause. How does that compare to, where we are at today with how many people have gotten the vaccine?
Yeah. So again, the scientific data is what they recorded from these, in the case of, let me go back to, you can see, you can see this slide. For the Pfizer, it's 43,000 people that they tested. For the Moderna, it was 30,000 people that they tested. And they really hardly saw any severe reactions. Here's the problem. There's always a question when something bad happens to an individual, an anecdotal story, do you attribute it, what do you attribute it to? Let me give myself as an example. I got vaccinated, okay? I also have some coronary artery disease. I also have an aneurysm, one of which has been operated on. I'm due to get an operation for a second one, hopefully in the next month or two, But purely from a medical point of view, there's a chance that my aneurysm may rupture, at any time. It's a low chance, but it's not zero, So it's possible that one could argue to say, gee, Dr. Gordan died suddenly from a ruptured aneurysm. Wasn't he the one who just recently got a vaccination? That doesn't mean that the vaccination had anything to do with that. So one really has to be careful. And I guess I would encourage people to really talk with public health officials, or people who are monitoring safety and things like that, particularly with the vaccine, to say, how do you put this into context? Because, events happen all the time. When I was in medical school, statistician, I believe, used to joke and say, every woman who's come down with breast cancer got mother's milk as a kid. But I don't think people would equate the two and say, well, therefore mother's milk causes breast cancer. Well, what about all the men who also had mother's milk and hardly any of them get breast cancer, for example, and things like that. So one has to be very careful when you have anecdotal cases. And that's why you have to have a good investigation. Usually it's your public health department that would be doing the investigation for an adverse event from giving out a vaccine or something like that. Or if, God forbid, someone were to die, then that falls into the realm of the medical examiner. And their job is to look at all of the data and sort of be able to say, what do you attribute death to in this particular case? Yes, I think in the trial, they did have a couple of people who had heart attacks. I think they had as many heart attacks, and just a very few of them. And I think they had as many in the folks who got the placebo as they did in the ones that got the vaccine. So one has to always be careful with anecdotal things, but unfortunately, you can't stop people from raising the question when they hear an anecdote like, gee, I heard this one person, something bad happened to them, and then they equate that with the vaccine. They really should talk to someone who is familiar with that vaccine distribution to sort of say, was that event something that you've seen more of? Or, someone who is involved with these trials to be able to say, is that something that's a common thing? Or is that something that seems to be a one-off type of event that may have had no relation to the vaccination at all? And that's about as best as, I can address on that issue. And again, unfortunately, we're going to continue to have, I think people coming out with all sorts of misinformation, like I saw, unfortunately, a video by someone, happened to be a doctor, believe it or not, who was claiming that the vaccine will change your DNA. There's no way that this kind of mRNA vaccine can do that. It doesn't have the capability. It's not a virus. It doesn't have the ability to really integrate into the DNA or do anything to your DNA. The same doctor was claiming that, you know, these are nanoparticles, and in there they're going to put, you know, small radio receivers so they can track your movements and things like that. You know, I don't know what to say about, you know, those kinds of stories, but they're going to come out and people will do them. No, there's no one's putting the, you know, tiny electronics into these, you know, vaccines and things like that. You know, if someone's tracking you, I'm sorry, if, you know, if the Soviet Union, or I'm sorry, if Russia wants to track you, they'll do a better job of breaking into your cell phone and a number of other ways if that's what they want to do. You know, they're not going to use a vaccine, you know, to do that with. So I think the only thing you can do is to say, gee, it's an honest question. You know, let me go ask someone who knows something about vaccines and knows something about vaccine biology, and let me see if they think that that makes sense or doesn't make sense. I mean, I think that's what you're going to have to do. And frankly, that's, you know, that's what Fauci has been doing, you know, for the last several months. You know, he gets on, you know, and sometimes I'm sure he sounds himself like a broken record, but that's part of the role that he needs to play, just to remind people to sort of say, you know, here are the facts about this disease. Here are the facts about the vaccinations. Here's the facts about, you know, different things. And you just have to continue to do that again and again and again. And I think that's the only way that you hopefully allay some of these fears and get rid of some of these myths that people have. We're in a tough time, and this is obviously a big challenge for this country to get over this.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, we just want to thank Dr. Gordan so much for his time and for really walking us through the science behind both the COVID virus as well as the vaccines. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions that they think about over time, you can email me at ethrash-sol@pvm.org, and I'll work with Dr. Gordan to get you some answers.
Yeah, by all means, I'm happy if you want to work through that email system. We're happy to answer any questions after the fact. So absolutely.
Right,
well, thank you all for attending, and you know, take care and be safe. And
thank you very much.
Don't forget to continue the social distance for now. I mean, we really have to do that until the whole population numbers start coming way down. That should really be the end point. You know, I know it's tiring for a lot of people. I know people are frustrated. You know, a lot of people didn't visit their family over the holidays and things like that. But we will get over this if we, you know, continue to do the social distancing and really get vaccinated. I think we will get over this. Thank you, folks, again, and you all take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.